My parents kicked me out at 18 for their new life. But karma made a jaw-dropping appearance years later, and then my parents, Carolyn and Martin, weren't the type to dream of family dinners or birthday parties when they got married in 1967. They made it clear to anyone who asked they weren't interested in kids. According to the few relatives I've talked to about it, my arrival in 1972 was a complete surprise. My mom used to say I was their little miracle, but the way she'd sigh and look away after those words told me the sentiment had faded. In the early years, things weren't so bad. I have hazy memories of us at the park, my dad pushing me on the swings, and my mom clapping her hands whenever I climbed to the top of the jungle gym. But by the time I hit elementary school, their interest in me seemed to shift into something less. Less attention, less enthusiasm, and certainly less time. Carolyn and Martin ran a business together, a high-end furniture store in Denver, Colorado. It was their pride and joy, something they'd built from the ground up. They lived and breathed it, and I came in a distant second, maybe even third if you count their collection of rare wines. I remember how the dining table was always covered in stacks of invoices and catalogs. They'd sit there, poring over paperwork, discussing inventory and sales numbers while I watched reruns of Scooby-Doo on the tiny TV in the corner. "Turn the volume down, Evan," Mom would say without looking up from her papers. "Sorry." I'd mumble and turn the knob down until I could barely hear it. That was my life, a quiet, small existence in the background of their ambitious one. Birthdays were a peculiar reminder of just how little effort they were willing to expend. On my 10th birthday, I sat alone on the playground at school, clutching the $20 bill they'd given me that morning. "Get yourself something nice, Evan," Mom had said as she handed it to me. There were no balloons, no cake, no friends invited over. Just me and that crumpled bill. It was the same story every year. Christmas wasn't much better. One December, when I was about 10, I asked them if we could get a Christmas tree. Their faces were blank, as though I'd just spoken in another language. After some begging, they gave in, but only because I found a fake tree on sale at the hardware store. I promised I'd set it up and take it down myself every year, and they agreed. Without that tree, Christmas would have been just another day on the calendar. It wasn't like I had extended family to fill in the gaps either. My grandparents lived far away, one set in New Mexico and the other in Minnesota. Visits were rare, and phone calls even rarer. I didn't really know them until I was an adult. Looking back, I wonder if my parents kept me isolated on purpose. Maybe they didn't want anyone else to notice how little they actually cared. I spent most of my childhood being raised by TV and school teachers. The characters on the screen felt more like family than my parents ever did. Teachers noticed when I did well on a spelling test or when I wasn't acting like myself. My parents? Not so much. If I had to describe them, I'd say they were the kind of people who wore black all the time, drank too much wine, and silently judged everyone else. They rarely laughed, and when they did, it was never at my jokes. By the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped trying to impress them altogether. One memory sticks out vividly. I was 12 and had just won a small art competition at school. My watercolor painting of the Denver skyline had been chosen to hang in the school's front office. When I told my parents, they gave me polite smiles but didn't even ask to see the painting. "That's nice, Evan," Dad said, already shifting the conversation back to a new client they'd landed. From that moment on, I stopped expecting much from them. Life at home was quiet and predictable. They went to work, came home, and immersed themselves in the business. I stayed in my room, reading comic books or watching TV. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. It was more like a dull emptiness, a space where warmth and connection should have been. The older I got, the more I realized how little they seemed to want me around. By the time I turned 16, I was desperate to find some way to connect with them. I asked if I could work part-time at their store, thinking it might give us something in common. They shut me down immediately. "We don't have any positions open," Mom said, her tone sharp enough to end the conversation. I didn't push back. I'd learned by then that it was useless to argue with Carolyn and Martin. Looking back, I wonder if they ever wanted me at all. Maybe I was just an inconvenience they learned to tolerate. Either way, I grew up knowing that I wasn't a priority. By the time I turned 18, it was crystal clear. "Evan, you're an adult now," Dad said one morning, sliding an envelope across the table. "It's time for you to move out." Inside the envelope was a notice to vacate. I had 30 days to pack my things and leave. They didn't ask if I had a plan or offer to help me get started. They didn't even give me a ride when the day came. I borrowed a truck from a friend's dad and moved into a dingy apartment downtown, where the windows rattled every time a bus passed by. Looking back on those years, I can't say I feel much nostalgia. My parents were like strangers I happened to live with, a pair of cold, distant figures who seemed to regret ever having me. Whatever love they might have felt in those early years had long since faded, leaving nothing but polite indifference in its place. And so, at 18, I stepped out into the world alone, carrying little more than a sense of relief that I didn't have to live in their shadow anymore. The day I moved out was a mess. My parents didn't help pack, didn't lend me a hand with anything. They just stood in the doorway of our suburban Denver house, watching me load boxes into the back of a borrowed truck. Carolyn offered a brief, "Take care of yourself," and Martin gave a nod that could have meant anything. No hug, no words of encouragement. When I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. The apartment I found wasn't much. It was a rundown place on the edge of downtown with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. The rent was cheap, and that was all I could afford with the part-time job I'd managed to land at a local convenience store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I thought I could make it work. For the first few months, I scraped by. I stocked shelves during the day and worked the register in the evenings. My manager, a sour-faced man named Mr. Perkins, had a knack for finding flaws in everything I did. If a display wasn't arranged to his liking, he'd bark orders at me in front of customers. If I was 5 minutes late from lunch, he'd make a scene about my poor work ethic. "You think this is a joke, Evan?" he snapped one afternoon when I forgot to clock in. "You're lucky to even have this job." I bit my tongue and nodded. I needed the paycheck. The truth was, Mr. Perkins didn't just treat me badly. He treated everyone badly. A few months into the job, I heard rumors that corporate was investigating him for stealing cigarettes from the store's inventory. It wasn't long before they fired him. Unfortunately, they let me go too, citing budget cuts. I knew better, though. My performance reviews, all written by Perkins, were less than stellar. Losing that job was like being thrown off a boat without a life jacket. My savings ran out quickly, and finding another job proved harder than I expected. I didn't have many skills, and most employers wanted someone with experience. My parents' advice, if you can call it that, was to figure it out. "Evan, you're an adult now," Carolyn said when I called to ask for help. "We can't hold your hand forever. Just find a job," Martin added. Any job. That was the last time I reached out to them. Without steady income, the bills piled up. Rent, utilities, groceries. It all became too much. I sold what little I had of value. My old gaming console, a bicycle, a few pieces of furniture. It wasn't enough. When the landlord finally gave me an eviction notice, I knew I had no choice but to leave. I spent the next few weeks bouncing between couches. Friends from high school let me crash for a night or two, but most of them were busy with college or moving out of state. Eventually, I ran out of options. By November, I was sleeping in a tent in someone's backyard. The nights were brutal, temperatures dropping below freezing. I wore every piece of clothing I owned and wrapped myself in layers of blankets, but it wasn't enough. Each night, I wondered if I'd wake up in the morning. The backyard belonged to a guy named Tim, an acquaintance from work. He didn't have much sympathy for my situation, but said I could stay as long as I didn't make a mess. I felt like an unwanted stray, tolerated but not welcomed. One day, Tim's neighbor, Linda, noticed me in the backyard. She was an older woman, probably in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She invited me into her home, offering me a hot meal and a place to sleep. "You shouldn't be out there in this weather," she said, setting a steaming bowl of soup in front of me. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Linda didn't just give me shelter. She gave me a chance to turn things around. After a few days, she handed me a folded piece of paper with a list of names and phone numbers. "These are your family members, right?" she asked. I stared at the list, recognizing some of the names. It was the contact information my parents had reluctantly given me years ago, scribbled onto a sheet of notebook paper. At the time, I hadn't done anything with it. Now, It felt like a lifeline. With Linda's encouragement, I made the first call. It was to my grandparents, Susan and Harold, who lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I hadn't spoken to them since I was a toddler. I wasn't sure if they'd even remember me. Hello? Susan's voice was cautious but kind. Hi, Grandma. It's Evan, I said, my voice shaking. There was a pause, and then an excited gasp. Evan? Is it really you? By the end of the conversation, they'd already booked a plane ticket for me. A week later, I stepped off a plane in Santa Fe, feeling like I'd entered a different world. My grandparents were waiting at the gate, their faces lighting up as soon as they saw me. Susan pulled me into a tight hug, her eyes brimming with tears. Oh, Evan, it's been so long. Harold patted my back, his voice steady and reassuring. You're home now, son. We'll take care of you. For the first time in my life, I felt truly wanted. My grandparents didn't just take me in, they gave me a fresh start. They helped me enroll in community college and supported me while I earned an associate's degree. Harold, a retired engineer, even used his connections to help me find a good job. Life wasn't perfect, but it was better. I finally had people who cared about me, who wanted me to succeed. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't fully let go of the bitterness I felt toward my parents. They'd thrown me out into the world with nothing, and now I was rebuilding my life without them. I didn't know it then, but my journey with Carolyn and Martin wasn't over yet. They'd find their way back into my life eventually, just not in the way I ever expected. Living with my grandparents, Susan and Harold, was like stepping into a world I didn't know existed. Their house in Santa Fe wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and welcoming. I had my own room, something I hadn't felt ownership of in a long time. Meals were eaten together at the dining table, conversations filled the air, and for the first time in years, I felt part of something bigger than myself. They supported me through everything. Susan took me shopping for clothes that weren't falling apart, and Harold tutored me in math when I struggled in my community college classes. I got my associate's degree in business administration after 2 years, and with Harold's help, I landed a solid office job with a local company. Things were finally stable. When Susan and Harold decided to move to Arizona for their retirement, it was bittersweet. The cold winters in New Mexico were too harsh for Susan's health, and a warmer climate made sense. They didn't just leave me with good memories. They sold me their house for a fraction of its value. It's yours now, Harold said as he handed me the keys. Just promise you'll take care of it. I promised, and for a while, everything felt right. By the mid-1990s, I'd settled into a routine. My job kept me busy, and the house became my haven. I didn't have much time for a social life, but that didn't bother me. After years of uncertainty, the peace and predictability were enough. Then, one cold December evening in 1996, my life turned upside down. I had been on a 2-week work trip, driving back home late at night. Pulling into my driveway, I noticed a large white van parked in front of the house. At first, I thought I was in the wrong place. But then I saw the logo on the side of the van, a familiar cursive script advertising fine furniture. It was my parents' old business logo. A chill ran through me, and not just from the cold. When I unlocked the front door, the smell of wine hit me immediately. Carolyn and Martin were sitting on my living room couch, looking as if they belonged there. My dad had a glass of red wine in his hand, and my mom was flipping through a magazine like she was at a waiting room. Evan, Carolyn exclaimed, smiling as if we were long-lost friends. What are you doing here? I stammered, still standing in the doorway. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Martin said with a dismissive wave. This was Susan and Harold's house, wasn't it? We figured it'd be fine if we stayed for a while. I felt my blood boil. It's my house now. You had no right to come in here. Carolyn rolled her eyes. Don't be so territorial. We raised you, didn't we? A little gratitude wouldn't hurt. I stared at them, unable to believe their audacity. They had broken into my home, made themselves comfortable, and were acting like they'd done me a favor. How did you even get in? I asked. Carolyn shrugged. You left a window unlocked. We just took the screen off and let ourselves in. Oh, and we found the spare keys on that hook by the kitchen. Convenient, really. I was furious, but I tried to stay calm. You need to leave.
Tonight.
Martin shook his head. We're not going anywhere. Legally, we've been here long enough to claim residency. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Residency? They'd been squatting in my house, and now they were using the law against me? The police weren't much help. When I called them, they listened to both sides and shrugged it off as a family dispute. My parents claimed we had a verbal agreement, even producing working keys and a printout showing my address as theirs on their new IDs. Without cameras or proof to counter their lies, the officers told me I'd need to take the matter to court. I was stunned. Over the next few months, living with my parents became unbearable. They refused to pay rent, contributing only a small amount to the utility bills. They treated the house as if it were still theirs, rearranging furniture and making demands. Carolyn even tried to claim the master bedroom, saying it was only fair since they were older. "You owe us this much, Evan," she said one evening, sipping her ever-present glass of wine. "We spent years raising you." I clenched my fists, trying not to explode. "Raising me? You threw me out as soon as I turned 18. Don't act like you did me any favors." Martin, usually quieter, chimed in. 18 years of our lives, Evan. You think that came cheap? It was maddening. They acted as if I owed them a debt I'd never agreed to, all while they freeloaded in my home. Meanwhile, I was drowning in stress. Their constant presence, their entitlement, their refusal to leave. It all ate away at me. I called my grandparents to vent, and they were horrified. Harold apologized repeatedly, saying they never would have sold me the house if they'd known my parents would pull a stunt like this. "Don't worry, Grandpa," I told him. "I'll get them out. I've already filed for an eviction notice." That was the only thing keeping me going. The knowledge that, eventually, the law would be on my side. For months, my parents played games. They alternated between guilt-tripping me and ignoring me altogether. When they realized I wasn't backing down, they started looking for apartments, but only half-heartedly. They seemed convinced they could break me before the court ruled in my favor. By the time the eviction hearing finally came around, I was ready to explode. The judge, thankfully, saw through their lies. "They have no legal right to remain in the property," he said, his tone firm. "They must vacate within 30 days. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. Finally, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. But my parents weren't done causing trouble. For the next month, they dragged their feet, packing their belongings as slowly as possible. Carolyn made a point of giving me sad, pointed looks whenever she passed by, as if I were the villain in some tragic story. On the day they finally left, I stood by the front door, watching as they loaded the last of their things into the van. I didn't say goodbye, and neither did they. As they drove off, I immediately changed the locks on every door in the house. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But I knew this wasn't over. Carolyn and Martin had a way of lingering like a bad memory, and something told me they'd be back in one form or another. For now, though, I was just grateful to have my home to myself again. The day my parents drove away from my house felt like the start of a new chapter. I stood on the porch, watching the van disappear down the road, and felt an overwhelming wave of relief. The last few months had been hell, but now I could finally move forward without their looming presence. For the first time in what felt like ages, my house was truly my own again. I spent the next few weeks reclaiming the space, rearranging furniture, deep cleaning every room, and even repainting the walls to erase the memories of their stay. It felt cathartic, like I was exorcising the ghosts of their selfishness and entitlement. Life slowly returned to normal. My job kept me busy during the week, and on weekends, I enjoyed the quiet solitude of my home. Sometimes, I'd invite friends over for a barbecue or movie night, but mostly, I was content on my own. That peace didn't last long. It started with a phone call from one of my grandparents' old neighbors in Arizona. They'd heard from Carolyn and Martin, who were now living in the same state. Apparently, they had inherited some property from my maternal grandfather, my mom's side of the family. The news caught me off guard. My maternal grandfather had passed away? I didn't even know he was sick. He'd never been part of my life, just a name I vaguely associated with my mom's childhood stories. Still, the thought of Carolyn and Martin living comfortably in a new house after everything they'd put me through made my stomach churn. A few weeks later, I heard they'd started a new business. My parents were nothing if not determined when it came to making money. Their old furniture store had been their pride and joy before it went under, and now they were apparently trying to replicate that success. I couldn't help myself. I looked up their new business online. It was a smaller operation than before, but the reviews were positive. Customers praised the quality of the furniture and the professional service. It was infuriating. After all the chaos they'd caused in my life, they were back to being successful, respected business owners. It felt like a slap in the face. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the anger lingered. My parents had invaded my life, turned my home into a battleground, and left me emotionally drained. Now they were thriving while I was still picking up the pieces. It didn't seem fair. I called my grandparents to vent. They were just as frustrated as I was, though for different reasons. They felt betrayed by Carolyn and Martin's actions, especially after selling me the house to give me a stable foundation. "They're toxic," Harold said over the phone. "They've always been like this, Evan. You're better off keeping your distance." He was right, of course, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to let go of the resentment. In the meantime, I threw myself into my work. My job required occasional travel, which gave me a chance to explore new cities and escape the memories tied to my house. I started thinking about the possibility of moving altogether, maybe even selling the house and relocating to Arizona to be closer to my grandparents. The idea was tempting. I loved my grandparents, and the thought of starting fresh in a warmer climate had its appeal. Winter had always been a struggle for me, especially after that freezing winter when I'd been forced to sleep in a tent. But moving wasn't a simple decision. My company didn't have an office in Arizona, which meant I'd have to find a new job. The thought of uprooting my life again was daunting, especially after all the work I'd put into building a stable foundation. Still, the idea lingered in the back of my mind, growing stronger with each passing week. To add to the tension, I couldn't shake the feeling that Carolyn and Martin might try to find me again. They didn't have my address, but that didn't mean they couldn't track me down if they really wanted to. The thought of them showing up unannounced, like they had before, made my skin crawl. I decided to take precautions. I installed security cameras around the property and made sure all my doors and windows were secure. It felt a little paranoid, but after everything I'd been through, I wasn't taking any chances. One evening, I sat down with a glass of wine and started making a list of pros and cons for selling the house. On one hand, staying put meant stability. I had a good job, a comfortable home, and a life I'd worked hard to build. On the other hand, moving to Arizona would give me a chance to start over, closer to the only family members who truly cared about me. By the time I finished the list, the decision still wasn't clear. My grandparents encouraged me to follow my instincts. "Do what feels right, Evan," Susan said during one of our phone calls. "You've been through so much already. You deserve to be happy, wherever that may be." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt like my life was dictated by circumstances beyond my control. My parents' neglect, their betrayal, their unwelcome return into my life. Maybe it was time to take control and choose a path that was truly my own. For now, I'm still figuring it out. Whether I stay in this house or move to Arizona, one thing is certain. I'm not letting my parents dictate my life anymore. They had their chance to be part of my world, and they squandered it. Now, I'm focused on building a future that doesn't include them. A future where I can finally feel at peace. Even if it takes time, I know I'll get there. Step by step, I'm reclaiming my life, and no one, not even Carolyn and Martin, can take that away from me. The next time I heard from Carolyn and Martin, it wasn't through a phone call or letter. It was a neighbor who told me they'd opened a business in the same state as me. It felt surreal to know they were close by again, but not surprising. My parents had always been resourceful, and now they were apparently bouncing back after inheriting property and money from my maternal grandfather. For weeks, I debated whether I should reach out or ignore the situation entirely. Deep down, I knew the answer. Carolyn and Martin had shown me exactly who they were, and I had no reason to believe they'd changed. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up their business online. The store had glowing reviews, customers praising the furniture and service. It was a smaller operation compared to their old store in Denver, but they seemed to be on the rise. I couldn't help feeling angry. They'd squatted in my house, put me through months of stress, and now they were thriving again. Meanwhile, I was still figuring out my next steps, contemplating selling my house just to escape the memories they'd left behind. It was around this time that I received a call from my maternal grandmother, who I hadn't spoken to in years. She had been estranged from my parents for as long as I could remember, but now she seemed eager to share news. "Did you hear about Carolyn and Martin?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. "They're living in your grandfather's old house now. Apparently, they're doing quite well." I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I heard. They inherited everything when he passed," she continued. "The house, the land, even some savings. That's how they started their business again." It all made sense now. My parents hadn't rebuilt their lives from scratch. They'd used an inheritance to climb back up. It wasn't illegal or even unethical, but it still stung. As the weeks went on, I noticed something changing in myself. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was exhausted. Exhausted from holding on to resentment, from replaying old arguments in my head, from wondering if they'd show up at my door again. One evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, and made a decision. I wasn't going to let them live rent-free in my mind anymore. Carolyn and Martin were part of my past, but they didn't have to define my future. That's when I started taking steps to move forward. I reached out to my grandparents in Arizona to discuss the idea of moving closer to them. Harold and Susan were thrilled at the prospect and offered to help however they could. "If you sell the house and need time to get settled, you can stay with us," Susan said. "We'd love to have you." The idea of being near them again gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I also began researching job opportunities in Arizona. While my current company didn't have offices there, I found a few positions that matched my skills. It wasn't going to be easy starting over, but I was willing to take the leap if it meant leaving behind the weight of my parents' influence. In the meantime, I made sure my house was as secure as possible. I added more cameras, reinforced the locks, and even spoke to a lawyer about what to do if my parents ever tried to pull the same stunt again. It felt good to be proactive, to take control of a situation that had once made me feel powerless. As I prepared for the possibility of moving, I reflected on everything that had brought me to this point. My parents' neglect, their betrayal, their entitlement. It had all shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. But it didn't define me. What defined me was the resilience I'd built over the years. The ability to survive when the odds were stacked against me. The courage to create a life that was entirely my own. By the time March rolled around, I had a plan in place. If I found a suitable job in Arizona, I'd sell the house and move closer to my grandparents. If not, I'd stay put and continue building my life in New Mexico, secure in the knowledge that I could handle whatever came my way. As for Carolyn and Martin, I decided to let them go. Not forgive, exactly. I wasn't sure I could ever truly forgive them, but release. They'd made their choices, and so had I. The last time I spoke about them with my grandparents, Harold summed it up perfectly. "They've burned too many bridges, Evan," he said. "You don't owe them anything. Focus on yourself and the people who truly care about you." That's exactly what I'm doing now. Whether I stay in New Mexico or move to Arizona, one thing is certain. I'm building a future that's free from the shadows of my past. Carolyn and Martin may have taken a lot from me, but they can't take away the person I've become. They say time heals all wounds. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but I do know this. Time has given me perspective, strength, and the determination to create a life worth living. And for me, that's enough. Life isn't always fair, but it's in our power to reclaim our story. Evan's journey shows the resilience it takes to rise above neglect and betrayal, to build a life that's your own. If you've ever felt like your past is holding you back, remember, you're not alone, and you can break free. Take control, set boundaries, and surround yourself with people who truly care. Your future is yours to shape, and it's never too late to rewrite your narrative. Start today, and make it one worth living. Subscribe and listen to new exciting stories.